Thank you all for coming to this session talking about key informant interviews and focus groups. And I only put key informant in there because that's sometimes how you see it, but otherwise we're talking about interviews and focus groups, and these tend to be lumped together, which is why I'm going to be talking about both of them at the same time. So the thing to know about these, like Deborah shared earlier, this is qualitative research that we're looking at. So the key informant interviews and the focus groups are concerned with words, not numbers. So you're going to get narratives, people's opinions, experiences. They are interviews and focus groups are common techniques for collecting this type of data. Specifically, if you want to get a little bit more in depth on what people's experiences are or their opinions about certain topics or the motivations they have, maybe beyond participating in a program. And to get into kind of the differences, we're going to start with the interviews. So interviews are guided one-on-one conversations. You will be using a interview protocol or an interview guide for your interviews to collect the firsthand accounts and events and experiences of the person that you're working with. In this situation, you as the interviewer are learning, and you're coming in humbly to figure out how your interviewee, who is the expert because they're sharing their experiences, they're giving you their story, is experiencing whatever the topic or phenomena that you're talking about. There are 3 types of interviews: structured, unstructured, and semi-structured. And it's important that even though I said one can be structured, one can be a little bit structured, and one has no structure, there is always structure in an interview because you're coming in with an idea and you're making you're trying to build a rapport to have a conversation with someone that usually ends up being very vulnerable because it is a one-on-one conversation that you're having with them. There is nobody else there to hear what they are saying or how they're saying it. But to dive in a little bit, when we're talking about a structured interview, that follows a predetermined set of questions that follows a specific format. So that will be your interview questions, and let's say you have 12, you are doing it in a specific, you're doing question 1 first, then you're doing question 2, then you're doing question 3. You are going along a specific format. So as you are developing your interview question, your interview protocol, you are organizing where the questions show up and how they relate to each other. And you want to ask them in that particular way because they usually build upon each other, what you're asking your interviewee. On the other hand, an unstructured interview is an interview that doesn't follow a predetermined set of questions. You might have jotted down like some topics that are interesting to you that you want to ask the interviewee about, but you're not going to give them too much of a structure to guide what they talk about. You can say, I wanted to hear what you feel about nature. And then you will take notes from whatever they're saying around that versus saying, I want to see how you define it. I want to see what types of activities you participate in it. I want to hear about the activities you don't participate in it. That would be more of a structured interview. And then a semi-structured kind of melds those together, where maybe you have, let's say, a list of 4 to 6 questions that you want to ask. There are specific questions that you want to ask, but you are okay with the flow of it. You are okay with allowing your interviewee to share more stories. And that just gives you a little bit more richer data to go through and analyze. But those are the 3 types usually when people are thinking about designing or thinking through how they will enter into these key informant interviews are, do you have a set of questions that you absolutely must ask? Or do you just have some topic areas that you would like your interviewee to think through? Or are you melding it together where you have maybe 4 questions you like to ask, but you're okay if they veer off from that and still stay in the general topic area of like outdoor rec or outdoor education? And then you have focus groups. Focus groups are similar to key informant interviews in that you are talking to someone, but you are talking to more than one someone in a focus group. A focus group usually is comprised of 6 to 10 people that are homogenous. And that is really, when we're talking about homogenous, we mean everybody in that focus group shares a characteristic or an identity. So maybe you want to hear about immigrant perceptions around nature. So everybody in that group is an immigrant. That's one characteristic that they share, and that's the experience that you're asking them to share from. How does their experience tied to nature? How is that informed by their lens of being an immigrant? In these types of groups, because it's so much more people, you usually have one moderator who is going through their moderator protocol and asking questions, but then you have a note taker who helps take notes. For the one-on-one interviews that happen in the key informant interview, you are asking the questions and also taking notes. You could also be recording it if you get the consent of your interviewee. Same thing with focus groups. You could be recording it as well, but it really helps to take notes during this because it helps with your active listening. And so having an extra person in there, they could be taking notes about the body language, different key phrases that people are saying, and just anything else that might be important that you might miss, because instead of you now paying attention to one person, you are paying attention to between 6 to 10 people and trying to make sure that you are helping to allow space for everybody to share, as well as everybody to hear from everybody else. Because one of the great things about a focus group is not only are people sharing their own thoughts and opinions and stories, but they build off of what comments they hear from other folks. So something that Dan says might trigger me to remember a memory or an experience that I have that I would share that I might not have shared without hearing Dan's story as well. So it's a really great method when we're talking about what is happening within a community as we are defining community in these single characteristic or identity bases, because we make sure that everybody within this group is connected in some way. So as an immigrant, what's happening within immigrant communities as they're thinking through nature. And as well as the key informant interviews, there is also a guide that helps you through it. But the guide is a little bit different because in a key informant interview, we are thinking through what does it look like to make your one interviewee feel safe and comfortable so that they can be vulnerable enough to answer your questions, or vulnerable enough to say no, because they have the right to, take back their consent and say they don't want to answer a question, or that they want to stop an interview if it gets too much for them, and that is completely fine. For a moderator guide, part of that guide that I've done in some of the focus groups that I've been a part of is we think about the logistics of the space that we're in. What does the seating arrangements look like? Do we make sure that we have name tags for everybody so that they understand who they are? How are we welcoming everybody into the space? Have we thought about if we're feeding them? How long is our focus group interview going to take? We hopefully, as everybody in the entire outdoor school team has tried to emphasize, we need to think about equity, we need to think about culture, we need to think about who is the best to ask questions or to be in these spaces, whether it's a key informant interview or a focus group interview, to make folks feel comfortable to share the stories that they want to share. So in a moderator guide, we're also thinking through that, and also what happens if someone is triggered by a question that we ask. You never know how someone's going to take a question. It could be a question that you think is very easy going or easy to respond to, but that again is thinking through your own bias and how you engage with that topic or within that space. And so how do we deal with trauma in these spaces? What do we need to ensure happens, or the supports that we need to ensure happen so that folks feel comfortable either leaving if they need to, letting you know that something has happened that makes them feel uncomfortable, or leaving for a little bit and then coming back. So having kind of those checkpoints in the moderator guide. So a lot of times that there's a lot more that goes to the guide besides just here are either the questions or the topics that I want to cover, but also here is what's going to happen if I was the moderator and Dan was my note taker and something happened to one of our participants, would Dan be the one to step aside and go to that participant and talk through with it, like through the issue with them, and see if they want to stop, if they want to just stop completely and leave that space, if they want to step out for a few minutes and collect themselves and then try to come back in. And that's all of those logistics are what we would negotiate before going into the space to help ensure that we are creating an environment that is conducive to people, yes, sharing their stories, but also saying, no, this is uncomfortable, please stop. And then us helping and giving resources for them. That is a great question. I do both. So the focus groups that I've been a part of, I negotiate with whoever the team is that's a part of that focus group. So there's one that I did recently where there were 2 note takers because the folks who are leading it were new to moderating focus groups. And so there was a moderator and then 2 note takers as a pair. We negotiated what it looks like and like kind of went through a worst case scenario if both of the note takers had to leave the space because they had to deal with a person who felt uncomfortable, what would happen to the moderator. But then also part of the moderator guide that I haven't seen too much in an interview guide is quite a few times community agreements come up. So we negotiate at the beginning, here are community agreements, let's have it on the wall or wherever we are. This is what it's going to look like to support each other in this space, because again, it's still a very vulnerable space, sharing your thoughts and opinions, thinking through power and privilege. As a moderator or a note taker, we do have power over the participants who are there because of our organization, or like, why are we doing the data to begin with? And there's a lot of mistrust from marginalized communities because of how research has been extractive and taken from their communities. So thinking through that. Negotiate. So for me, the way that I was trained is that negotiation happens in multiple stages to make your persons feel comfortable that they can say stop and you will abide by that, or that they know coming in you have done what as much as you can to make it as inclusive, also knowing that yes, things are going to come up because we can never know everybody and their identities and where they intersect and how those questions are going to hit them or be interpreted by them, but that they believe that you will do whatever you can to alleviate as much harm or to address the harm when it shows up. Like that is something that is really important to think through. So Great question. Kind of good. So the basic things are the key informant interviews offer an opportunity to do a deep dive into the experience, knowledge, etc. of one particular person. It also, sometimes people are saying that it allows for more vulnerability because it's just that one person with just you. Say what they want to say. Focus groups also is a space to have to go a little bit deeper into the personal experience and knowledge of people within a particular community, because, you know, the groups tend to be pretty small, 6 to 10, which is big enough to allow for a rich, robust discussion, but small enough so that everybody should be able to have a voice or take up space in that environment and say what they want. And it also allows for people to respond to the comments of the others that are in that space. So you're getting a little bit better understanding of how different communities are interpreting or processing or working through things. It's not perfect, and it definitely is not something that you can understand with one focus group. Most of the time, you at least are doing 3 focus groups with a particular community, if not more, to delve in and to make sure that you are getting a better understanding of what they're saying. Which is also making me think of some of the considerations that I've always done and that I've been trained to do when thinking about key informant interviews, as well as focus groups. And one of them is, because we are either audio recording or video recording or taking notes, the audio and video recordings, as soon as we've transcribed them, we send them to the participants so they can read through and check. Did they say anything by accident that they didn't want to say? Because they have the right to say, I want you to remove this. I didn't need to say this. You know, thinking through what does safety look like? What does anonymity look like? How are you going to share this data? Are you going to, are you going to give them pseudonyms or anonymize the data, kind of like Steve does in his, now I've already forgotten Steve's report, but the big report. And then like during the AC meeting where he was like, this 6th grader said this comment about being at outdoor school. It's anonymized because it's a 6th grader. We don't know what 6th grader, what community they're from, but definitely giving people access to the transcripts helps them feel more confident about the fact that you are going to protect their privacy and their vulnerability in that space. So after each interview or focus group I've done, we have sent the participants the transcript and notes and said, is there anything that feels uncomfortable? There are, which is just the way that I've been trained to do it, and I feel that that feels comfortable around that. It's also thinking about, what does power and privilege look like? Not just at you as the interviewee or the moderator or a note taker or your organization and that relationship between the community or that person. But if you're doing focus groups, no social identity group is a monolith, and power shows up in each of those groups. Like someone who's on the inside or has more social capital than somebody else within that group. So not only thinking about the power and privilege of yourself and your organization, but what does power and privilege look like within that community? And who may feel like they are excluded from saying certain stuff from other community members, who is taking up more space, like being aware of who takes more space in those focus groups and how can you mitigate what that looks like. Part of mitigating for that is including members of that community in a planning team with your organization when you are designing your moderator protocol. So we've had, the one that I've done most recently was working with high school and early adult youth. So like 16 to 21, I think. And we had a small subset of them help craft the questions. So we were looking to see that the questions were culturally responsive, that they made sense for that community. But we also asked them questions about who has more social capital and who would feel that they don't have the ability to say something because of the group that we have crafted, and should we split the group in different ways. So that also helps give you some insight, especially if you are outside of the community that you are trying to go into these conversations and interviews with. I spelled consent wrong. consent. Verbal. I was like, what is that word? Verbal consent, written consent. Who do you get consent from? The parent, guardian, the school. For a couple of the doctoral students in my program, they have gotten it from everybody. So if they're going into a school, they have to get consent from like the district and the school, but they also have to get consent from parents or guardians if they're going to be interviewing parents and like the kids. So there are, and then you get, that's like an assent form because the student signs it, but also their parent or guardian signs it since they're not of legal age.
Right.
So consent becomes more complicated when you're thinking through like working with youth.
And especially with school districts, because they have their own policies about that. And so you have to know what their requirements are going to be if you're going to be talking to their students or teachers for that matter.
Mm-hmm. And same thing with certain community groups like tribal communities, or like they might have their own or be institutional review board or something to that effect that looks at the ethics of what the research question is, or just how it's impacting them, and whether or not the risk is too great, or if it's a minimal enough risk that it's okay that you're asking some of the questions. And I just went off for no reason. But yeah, so like consent is big. Safety, what does safety look like? Again, where are you having these interviews? If it's one-on-one, are you asking them to come to your site or organization? Do they feel comfortable doing that, or would they rather meet you somewhere that is where they feel more comfortable being going through? So like, what does that look like? Being like negotiating what that looks like, but also so in those one-on-one spaces and also for focus groups. And then Deborah mentioned this earlier, compensation. Like I said before, this is a humility thing, because as the interviewer or the moderator, we are learning from the experts who are the interviewees that we are having these conversations with. We are asking a lot of emotional labor from them. We're asking for their expertise. We're asking for their knowledge. What does compensation look like? For some people, they are able to give like gift cards and pay. For some, it's thinking through, can we pay for like food when this is happening? So some of the youth-centered focus groups that I've been a part of in the last 6 or so months, it's happened in the evening. So the organization has bought food for the youth, and sometimes their family, if they're involved. And that is something that helps, just like having a conversation with your organization, but then also with that community. What possibly could compensation look like so that it doesn't feel extractive, or that we are not taking their understanding, their wisdom for granted. Just thinking through, like, that's an important thing to think through. And if you cannot give money, recognize that money is not the only type of compensation. You know, thinking through what your data looks like. If you're creating a journal, like an academic journal article, or some kind of white paper or something to that sense, does anybody that you are working with want to have some kind of authorship around that, so that you're naming them as part of your evaluation process? That's also some way to think about what compensation looks like. But I think that that's really important to think through. So that was a really short, kind of deep toe dip into key informant interviews and focus groups that I wanted to provide you with, because I wanted the majority of this to be about questions that you all have. And thank you for stopping me along the way, or just trying to giving you enough time to have self-reflection, to look through what would this look like with the data collection worksheet that you have started, or thinking through some of your evaluation questions. Are there any other questions that folks have? I think that is a good thing to think through. That's not you. Yeah, I think it's definitely a good thing to think through, and whether or not it's effective. I guess my questions are, at what point are we thinking this through? Like, if this is something that you wanted to do in 2 months, that might be too quick to think about who you could ask to be a part of this, thinking through not only consent, figuring out also like what youth. Is everybody that you're thinking about 18 years and under? How are we getting the consent of their parents and guardians, of the schools, possibly? What does that look like? And understanding that school process, because some of the school processes, oh, you are totally right. I talked a little bit too long. Some of the school processes are super long around consent. So these are conversations that I would get into with the schools as soon as possible, but also just to have that understanding, but also think through your organization, like, what exactly is the outcome that you want, and why do you want to use youth for that? Is that something that can be like a second phase in an evaluation process, where first you ask the adults and then you ask the youth, so that you build some rapport with the adults that are in the community of the youths, and that makes it a little bit easier transition? I just think about, it's going to take a lot of time. And so are we building in how much time it takes, especially when we're working with any marginalized community that could be vulnerable?